When I received my assignment to the regiment, I learned that it was located near the village of Yedrova on the road from Moscow to Leningrad. The railroad station had the same name. I reached Yedrov by hitchhiking. It was about 10 kilometers from Vipolovo, on the shore of a large lake. The village is quite large. Not far behind the village I could see a coniferous forest. I asked the first commander I met where the regiment headquarters was. I was pointed to one of the houses on the outskirts of the village, which was closer to the forest. All formalities were quickly settled, and I was assigned to a battery, which was part of the division. There were usually 3 such divisions in the regiment, with 3 batteries in each. They were armed with 76 mm guns of the 1902 model. With such guns, the Russian army fought in the First World War. Each gun was driven by 6 horses harnessed in pairs, that is, one pair after another. The division was housed in dugouts, and there were primitive, hastily built stables nearby. The battery commander was Senior Lieutenant Dolgopolov, a former engineer of one of the factories. The cadre commander of the division, Captain Butorin, did not call him otherwise than Engineer Dolgopolov, expressing some disdain for his former profession. The deputy battery commander was a cadre officer, Lieutenant Proshok. He usually drew and looked down on the rest of the officers called up from the reserves. The commander of the reconnaissance platoon was a reserve Lieutenant Mosipovits. He was a hard worker, with a purely rustic thoroughness to his official duties and our simple life. The commander of the first firing platoon and the senior on the battery was Lieutenant Olkovic, a Leningrader balagier and master of jokes. He was also from the reserve. The commander of the second firing platoon was a lieutenant with a Polish surname, I think also from Leningrad. All of us, platoon commanders, were located in one dugout, and not far away were the dugouts of the battery commander and his deputy, as well as the dugout of the personnel. In our dugout for each of the poles was made a makeshift bed on which were laid a pile of spruce branches, a straw mattress, the same pillow and a soldier's blanket. The canteen was in the open air. It was not even a canteen, but a field kitchen, from which each of us received food in a kettle and, seated under any pine tree, had a meal. Each of us had a spoon and an aluminum mug in addition to the wok. In general, the living conditions were as close as possible to field conditions, or rather to combat conditions. Besides, not far from our location there was an engineering prepared, obviously rear, defence strip of the northwestern front. Trenches in full height, lined with poles steep, armoured hoods. Part of the trenches were covered, there were bunkers and other defensive structures. What did the Reserve Artillery Regiment do at that time? The main task was to train soldiers and sergeant specialists for the front. Conscripts who had no special training, as well as those recovering from hospitals, arrived here. Here in the regiment there were horses, which were also trained to act as a pulling force in the horse artillery. Here were also horses that had been wounded after their treatment in field veterinarians. I, as I mentioned before, was appointed commander of the communications platoon instead of the former platoon leader who had left for the front. I had to teach the soldiers the wisdom of field telephone communication. It turned out that I myself was learning and teaching my soldiers. It should be borne in mind that I was only 18 years old, and most of the soldiers were much older than me, even 2 or 3 times older than me. I think it is easy to understand that in order to teach others, it is not enough to have only special knowledge, you must have at least a modest life experience. In fact, I had neither of these. Life-wise sergeants and soldiers helped me. Subsequently, at the front I met former subordinates. One platoon, which I trained, was sent to the front almost in its entirety to the Army's Communications Regiment. I met them somehow. They remembered our platoon and their studies in the Reserve Artillery Regiment with gratitude. A lot of effort and time was spent on taking care of the horses. In our battery sometimes there were up to 100 horses. They had to be fed, cleaned. Sometimes when the next platoons went to the front, we, the commanders, got 10 horses each. Practically from morning till evening we were busy with horses. In addition, regularly, at least once a week, the division commander conducted a brooding of horses. This is a kind of check on the condition of the horse, including its cleanliness. The commander of the division, Captain Butorin, before the war, a cavalry artilleryman, was especially zealous about the condition of horses. Together with his deputy on political part, Captain Butelin and the Chief of Staff in white gloves checked the most secret places of the horse, and if the gloves were covered with dirt, then the penalty could not be avoided, gave another hour of time and again check. Almost daily riding lessons were held with all the officers of the division. On a small clearing in the forest was equipped with a primitive riding arena. The division commander stood in the centre of the arena with a long twig and gave commands training trot, march, bolt to the left, bolt to the right, drop the stirrup, etc. It was especially difficult when the command drop the stirrup was given. We had to sit in the saddle of a horse galloping at a training trot, holding on with our legs. Our legs got tired quickly, and we could hardly stay in the saddle, or even fall from the horse to the ground. We managed to insert the outside leg secretly from the commander into the stirrup. We moved in a circle, and he did not always notice or pretended not to notice. But often for such liberty the horse was hurt. The long rod got it, and sometimes even the saddler, so that he did not cheat. Each of us was assigned a riding horse. I had one too. It was obviously an ordinary collective farm horse mobilized for the army. It did not know the commands, and I tried to drive only a tractor in the school, and at first I did not know the cavalry commands. Moreover, I did not know how to cut a vine at a gallop with a sabre. There were cases when instead of a vine the horse was hit on the right ear or from behind on the croup. I, however, did not have such a case. Soon we received horses from the veterinary hospital after treatment for wounds. I chose a puny, thin-legged horse, saddled it, sat in the saddle and spurred it. The horse immediately stood on its hind legs and did a cavalry-like candle. I did not expect such a thing and found myself on the ground. The horse stood next to me with its ears pressed back, waiting for punishment. Of course I did not punish it. I stroked it, calmed it down, realized that I should act carefully with spurs with this horse. I sat in the saddle and went to the riding arena, expecting to teach the horse to carry out cavalry commands. At the trot, I give a voice command bolt to the right. March. The horse instantly executed the command, a 360-degree turn over the shoulder. I, of course, did not expect such a jump. I thought that it was necessary to duplicate the command with the action of spurs. For each command there is a certain action by spurs, so I was on the ground again, flying out of the saddle when the horse made a sharp turn. I had to apologize to the horse for my oversight. I realized that I was dealing with a well-trained cavalry horse. But then, during the training ride, all I had to do was to stay in the saddle. The horse itself clearly and quickly carried out commands, for which I several times received praise from the commander, although 70% of it was the merit of the horse. We became fast friends. Every time I went to the stables, I would bring her a piece of bread sprinkled with salt. She already felt from afar that I was coming, and joyfully slowly roared. In general, the horse is a kind and intelligent animal, quickly gets used to the owner, and if you treat it well, it becomes loyal and affectionate, horse affection, of course. She'll rub her face on your shoulder or your cheek. During the war years I had to deal with a horse almost all the time, and if it died or for some reason went to another part, it was a loss of a close friend for me, and obviously for it. Such was the case in September 1943, when our division switched completely to Metiaga. The army demanded and strictly enforced cleanliness in the stables, no worse than in any barracks, but you had to spend a lot of labour to achieve it. We built the stable ourselves. There was a forest around. It turned out to be quite decent. There were more than 100 horses in the division, so the stable was big. We were supplied with forage centrally, including hay, but in summertime we went to make hay ourselves. It was difficult to be on duty in the stables. It was obligatory to appoint an officer as a duty officer, who was assisted by several day watchmen. They were charged with the duty to do all the work in the stables. It was necessary to work there for a full day to do all the work. The stable outfit had no right to rest even at night. Often in the division and in the regiment organised all kinds of equestrian and horse battery competitions. At the first ones they usually evaluated the horse, and of course its owner by training, the horse's ability to correctly execute commands. At the second, the ability to quickly, coherently take a firing position in time to change it, etc. That is, what is practically done in a combat situation. Our firefighters, as they call the firing squads and platoons that provide maintenance of guns and firing from them, performed all the required actions dashingly. Under the leadership of their commander, Lieutenant Olkovic, they were rushing swiftly across the field without a road, bouncing on bumps so that it seemed about to overturn, but everything went safely. In general, the sight was interesting. Up to a dozen of gun crews at a trot, or even at a gallop, flew to the firing position, quickly unhooked the guns, put them in a fighting position and simulated firing. Even the horses felt and gave in to the excitement of the competition. My platoon also sometimes participated in such competitions, providing the battery's fighting order with telephone communication. In 1942 there were still few radio stations. In artillery there was a radio station 6PK, but they were few. Besides, it was bulky. It consisted of 2 packages. It was carried and serviced by 2 men. At the school I had to deal with it. It was unreliable, and the main means of communication in the batteries throughout the war remained telephone communication. In the winter of 1941/42, we sometimes had to clear the runway at the front airfield in Vipolovo. We walked 10 kilometers in the evening, and then spent the whole night clearing the runway of snow. As a rule, all night it was snowing, quite heavy, and we were shoveling it all night and dumping it outside the runway. The work was tiring, and we platoon commanders worked together with the soldiers. There was nowhere to warm up. The strip was long. The airfield buildings were far away. We warmed ourselves with a shovel, shoveling snow falling from the sky. Training and work in the battery and division went their way. Almost the whole day was occupied with work. There was almost no personal time. Sometimes on Sunday there were 2 or 3 free hours. We went to the village to solve any of our problems, to the post office, to the store, to the cinema, and so on. We lived in dugouts. The walls were sooty. The stove was often smoky. There were a lot of rats which got so brazen that they fearlessly searched our belongings for food even during the day. Often there were fights between them, especially at night. Each of us had 2 or 3 bottle-shaped grenades from World War I under our heads, and we threw them into the tangle of fighting rats, of course without removing the safety pin. Once we brought a big cat caught somewhere in the village. The first night there was a real wild fight between the cat and the rats. As a result of the fight, which we hardly separated, the cat was so injured that the next day he died. Sometimes at night we would wake up to some fussing under our blanket. A cheeky rat would settle down near you for a rest. Once the division had a primitive machine with which they cut shingles, small flat logs, usually 25 to 30 centimeters thick. They used it to make roofs over houses in villages, and we over our buildings. It turned out to be a kind of wooden shingles. We decided to ennoble our dugout and covered the walls and ceiling with shingles. And since the walls and ceiling were made of logs, after lining there were voids under the shingles. At night, some rats crawled in from one end under the shingle and others from the other. The rats would meet, but as neither wanted to yield, another fight would ensue. The duty officer would fire 1 or 2 shots from his pistol. The rats scattered and silence was established for a while. We fell asleep, but soon the pattern repeated itself, so we had to sleep at night. In the spring and summer of 1942, mosquitoes were bothering us. The forest, the proximity of the lake and marshes favoured their breeding, and they mercilessly attacked us, giving us no rest, neither day nor night. Only when we dozed off, covered with a blanket, a mosquito with a nasty itching got in somewhere and did its work. We had to put on a gas mask without a box at night. We were young and, of course, we were up to all sorts of mischief. Just when someone dozed off, they would sprinkle fag or pepper into the corrugated tube or even make smoke. They had to tear the gas mask off their heads when they were sleepy, often with a tuft of hair. Life went on as usual. Sometimes enemy planes appeared and dropped bombs, mostly on the village and the station. We were well sheltered from aerial observation by a dense pine forest. To wash in the bathhouse we walked to Vipolovo. One day in the summer of 1942 our column entered the village, and approaching the centre, pulled up, took a military look and sang the song "Get Up Country Huge, Get Up for Mortal Combat." Young voices energetically picked up the refrain, "Let the noble rage boil up like a wave. There goes the People's War, the Holy War." On the other side of the street were wooden barracks that housed German prisoners. Hearing the song, many of them approached the wire fence, listening to its unfamiliar and disturbing motive. When the formation began the refrain again, it was picked up by the girls' voices as well. In the street perpendicular to ours showed a formation of girls, quite large, 80 or 100 in number. When they heard our song, they joined us in the chorus with gusto. Their line turned to the street where we were walking. The song sounded powerfully through the hushed village. There was so much hatred for the enemy and confidence in our victory. The inhabitants of the village came out of their houses, and with tears in their eyes saw off our formation. The captured Germans from such a loud melody began to hide behind the barracks. Never before or later had I heard such an emotional performance. Soon our roads parted. We went our way and the girls theirs. It was some kind of training unit, where they prepared specialists for the front. I was appointed platoon commander in Vipolovo, where there was a separate division of reserve officers artillerymen of the northwestern front. Officers arrived here from hospitals, from schools, from units during their reorganization. I had to hold classes with them. I conscientiously prepared for them. But the situation was quite ridiculous. As I remember now, in my platoon there was one colonel, several lieutenant colonels, majors and captains, mostly all career officers who had been in combat, and I was a lieutenant with 6 months of training. They understood my position, and when I took them to tactics classes outside the village, they asked me to take a watch, and they would take a nap under the bushes in the sun. I faithfully did it, making sure that suddenly the superiors did not appear. The same picture was in other platoons, located not far from my platoon. What could we teach them if we ourselves had primitive training? During my service in the regiment, and then in the reserve division, I constantly bombarded my superiors with reports asking to be sent to the active part. However, I was not the only one. After all, by the fall of 1942, the enemy came to the Volga River near Stalingrad, approached the Caucasus, blocked Leningrad, and on the northwestern front there were persistent battles. Although the Germans were thrown back from Moscow, they did not give up hope to launch an offensive again. There were persistent defensive battles. In November 1942, my request was finally satisfied. I was assigned to a combat unit 37th Guards Artillery Regiment of RGK. On a hitchhiker I reached the front. Good thing it was not far from Yedrov. In the summer and fall of 1942, the northwestern front fought heavy battles. The terrain here was extremely unfavourable for fighting, wooded and swampy. The northwestern front was formed at the beginning of the war from the Baltic Military District. It covered the direction to Leningrad from the southwest and to Moscow from the northwest. By the time of my arrival to the front line, that is, by December 1942, the front was engaged in heavy fighting at the line of Lake Ilmen, the town of Kayim. Between these points, approximately in the middle, there was a large ledge in our side, in the centre of which was the town of Demyansk. This ledge was called Demyansk Cauldron. At the end of 1941, 6 German divisions fell here. But in fact the cauldron, i.e., encirclement, it was only at the beginning of 1942. Then Hitlerites managed to break through the corridor. It was called Ramushevsky, by the name of the village Ramusheva, which was here. The width of the corridor was on average 6 to 8 kilometers, but the troops of the northwestern front could not eliminate this bulge. All 1942 and the beginning of 1943 there were fierce battles here. Our troops constantly attacked the enemy, and he had already adapted to these attacks, strengthened his positions, and we could not advance a step. The impression is that it was a meat grinder which daily grinded our divisions. Technology and primarily our tanks could not be used. We were surprised and even resented that the attacks were conducted in a straight line and practically in one place. And only after the war one realized that these attacks were forced, so that the enemy could not remove from our direction at least part of his troops to transfer them to the Stalingrad direction or to the Caucasus, where there were also fierce battles. But at the cost of huge losses, the front managed to fulfill this task. In addition to the usual field troops, naval brigades from the Far East fought here. I remember columns of sailors in black coats and overcoats. The Germans called them Black Death. 4 or 5 days passed, and from a full-blooded brigade there were a few people left, who went to the rear on 2 or 3 sledges. Divisions in 1 or 2 weeks lost up to 80% of their personnel. It is well known that in winter the Germans made broomsticks out of the corpses of our soldiers for their front line, stacking them and pouring water on them, as digging, as a rule, was impossible. The water, which in many places was 20 to 30 centimeters from the surface, did not allow. When Demiansky Ledge was formed, Hitlerites laid a narrow-gauge railway there, which was used to bring ammunition, food, equipment, etc. It was very important. We called this road cuckoo. When the next train came, the locomotive would make a sound resembling a cuckoo's cry. We did not have such a road. The transportation was carried out by motor transport. The roads, even in the dry season, were difficult to pass, especially in swampy places, and in the spring thaw the terrain became a solid swamp, on which transport could not move practically. In this regard, a Lezhnevka was built to the front. At first, a continuous planking of logs was laid across the track, and longitudinal logs were fastened on top of them, the upper part of which was chiselled off. After certain distances, passing tracks were made. At the command of the commandant of the road, the next column of cars moved along the track, while the oncoming cars waited at the parting. Then the oncoming column moved on. If a vehicle stopped for any reason and could not move forward on its own, it was mercilessly dumped on the roadside, usually in a swamp. Due to the difficulties of transportation, the front was constantly experiencing shortages of ammunition and food, and in spring the transportation was carried out with great difficulty, and there was a real hunger strike at the front. We dug out horses killed in winter from under the snow and cooked this meat in cauldrons on fires. But even this was a rare success. The soldiers were starving. They cooked porridge from birch bark. In general, who could get out of the situation? So, at the beginning of December 1942, I arrived at the front line. At night it was not difficult to identify it. The Germans for the night put out a combat guard from each company. The rest at this time slept. The combat guards were firing flares all night long, so there was illumination over the front line all the time. We didn't have that. There were only rockets just for signalling. By evening I found the rear units of the regiment to which I was assigned. They were located in a pine forest, however. The forest there was almost solid. Sometimes there were small fields, somewhere there were villages and arable land. As a rule, there was almost nothing left of the villages. The rear units were located on higher ground, and they were equipped with dugouts. It was difficult to look for the regimental headquarters in the dark, so I found a small empty dugout with dry grass, burrowed into it, and slept until morning. In the morning I went to the regimental headquarters. I was quickly formalized and appointed to the post of commander of the communications platoon of the headquarters battery of the 37th Guards Artillery Regiment of the RGK. The regiment was attached to the 1st Shock Army and at that time supported the fighting of the 14th Rifle Corps, which was engaged in heavy battles. War is war. There was no time and no one to understand that I had graduated from an artillery school and not from a communications school. My task was briefly explained to me to provide the regiment commander, or rather his observation post and regimental headquarters, with telephone communication with the divisions. We also had radios, but the main type of communication was the telephone. The platoon which I was to command was in action, that is, in combat order. Naturally, I had to familiarize myself with it during the fighting. I was escorted to the regimental commander's post, which was not far from the front line of our troops. The front edge in this place was in the woods, on the edge of the swamp, and to see the enemy, at least his front edge, it was necessary to climb a tall tree. Near this tree, a powerful sprawling pine, was a small dugout of my platoon. It was dug out on a small knoll. It was impossible to dig deep, the water did not give, so in the dugout it was possible only to sit. It was possible to stand bent. The earth bunks were covered with spruce lapnik, and the entrance was closed with a soldier's cloak tent. There was no window. If something had to be done by light, a piece of cable fixed under the ceiling was set on fire. The cable smoked mercilessly and stank of burning rubber, but there was some light. The dugout was covered with poles and pine lapnik. At night we slept in a huddle. Even turning around was only possible with difficulty. Here at the NP there were 2 squads. One squad was commanded by Sergeant Kulchenko, a combine harvester from a collective farm somewhere in the Saratov region. His upper lip was cut with a deep scar. A few months ago he had been captured by the Germans, here in the NWF, and told how the convoyers took a group of prisoners a few hundred meters away and shot them while they were moving. Kulchenko's bullet hit the back of his head, then, having knocked out a row of teeth, came out through his upper lip. Having lost consciousness, he fell into the ditch, where the rest of those shot fell. He woke up at night. He managed to get out to his men. After being cured in the hospital, he was assigned to the platoon as a squad commander. He was a thorough man, somewhere around 40 years old. I was more than twice his age, and he especially at first gave me a lot of advice and help. The second squad was commanded by a sergeant whom everyone in the platoon called Zina. I also called him that, thinking that it was his surname. But soon, when we celebrated the new year 1943, I found out that it was a nickname. At the front, everyone was given 100 grams of vodka a day. It was not always delivered, and there was not always time and conditions to drink it. Besides, the regiment commander ordered that those who were on the front line should be given 150 grams at the expense of the rear men. By the new year, we had a flask for each of us. Late in the evening, we built a festive table in the dugout under the light of the cable. Somewhere we took a couple of shell crates, covered them with a cloak tent, opened cans of canned food. At that time, American stew was very popular, which the soldiers jokingly called the second front. We gathered in the dugout, all free from duty, at the telephone points. In total, there were 4 or 5 people and me. To tell the truth, I hadn't drunk yet, only had a sip or two and sat listening to soldiers' stories. After drinking, my subordinates boasted to each other about their thieving deeds. One told how he had robbed a department store, another how he had robbed a savings bank, etc. Sergeant Zina listened, then, hitting his spoon on the box, said that he was the ataman of the gang on Kolodnaya Gora in Kharkov. There is such a neighborhood there even now. I sat in the corner and thought where I had gotten to not a platoon, but a gangster's raspberry. Having calmed down, everyone went to bed, together with them and I, thinking that much of what I heard they made up. But later I learned from the battery commander that it was true. In the summer, the regiment received a replenishment, which arrived by an arresting train from the places of detention. All of them were criminals, and not a single political one. Looking ahead, it must be said that they fought well. Obviously, their reactive nature and bandit habits found an outlet in the soldiers' liberty. One day I noticed that one of the soldiers was hiding his face from me, which was broken, blackened, and swollen. Attempts to find out what was the matter ended with the soldier's assurances that during the shelling he had fallen and hit his face. It could well have happened. But suspecting that something was wrong, I began to ask Zina what is it he hesitated at first, but then told me that this soldier was a former pickpocket thief. They, former real thieves and bandits, despised such people. But that wasn't the point. He was found guilty of stealing a ration of bread for which he was beaten. Food was hard to come by. Bread was divided equally among all, and one of them turned away and said which piece went to whom. And since most of the soldiers were always on duty at the telephone points or were engaged in repairing the telephone line, the bread ration was lying in the dugout until they came. So this thief got into the habit of sneaking bread. The soldier remained hungry practically all day long, having been deprived of his bread ration. Meals at the front line were usually 2 times a day in the morning before dawn, when it was dark and the enemy could not see, and in the evening when it was dark. In general, daily life at the front was the most primitive. All day long there is a fierce battle, and only have time to do your job, which I will tell you about below. In the evening the battle usually subsides, you need somewhere to dry off and rest. Our dugout had no stove. We dried by the fire, and in order not to be noticed by the enemy, we arranged it somewhere near the roots of a dislocated tree or in a funnel, if there was no water there, and sometimes we made something like a hut out of spruce lapniks and dried there by a small fire. Here they also got rid of lice, of which there were many, and some of them were literally swarming. They took off their shirts or underpants and held them over the fire until the lice were properly roasted. The same procedure was done with the outer garments. However, an overcoat or a dungaree could not be put over the fire, and the lice remained there. During the day, while you were running, you could not feel them, but at night they were bothering you. We went to the bathhouse not more than once a month. The bathhouse was a small area fenced with branches, and lapnik was placed on the ground. All the clothes, except for the belt and boots, were given for roasting, which was an ordinary iron barrel. Some water was poured on the bottom of the barrel, chocks and a grate of rods were put on it, and the uniforms were laid on it. The barrel was placed over the fire. The water in the barrel boiled and the clothes were steamed with hot steam. This procedure lasted 1 hour. During this time, everyone was given a bucket of hot water for washing. Naturally, most of the time we had to dance naked in the cold, especially in winter. Soldiers and officers had no bedding. An overcoat or a half coat, a trench coat, a duffel bag that was all the dowry. If we managed to squeeze into a dugout, we slept together, pressed against each other to keep warm. Sometimes, if the situation allowed it, a fire was built in the evening, or rather, before dark. When the ground under the fire got warm, the coals were raked out. Lapniks were laid and we lay down, covered with a cloak tent. It was warmer that way than in an unheated dugout. As a rule, there were no toiletries either. It was good if one managed to rinse his face in the morning from a puddle or a swamp, wiping it with the hollow of his overcoat. Most of them were grimy from the soot of the fires. In general, life was the most primitive. Now a few words about the front, or rather, the front line. That was the name of the front line and the nearest rear, shot by rifle and machine gun fire. On the first day, my ideas about the front were fully confirmed. At dawn, a fierce battle began. Our troops tried to attack the enemy. He, of course, with all firepower, repelled our attack. The rumble of our artillery and mortar cannonade merged with the rumble of bursts of enemy shells and mines, the crack of machine gun, and rifle shots, shouts of hurrah, swearing, shouts and groans of the wounded, all this merged into a continuous heavy rumble of battle. This music was supplemented by air battles in the sky, furious bombing and assault strikes of enemy aircraft. Near the front line, the forest was very badly battered by shells and bombs. Most of the trees were broken or cut by shrapnel at various heights. The ground was riddled with trenches, almost entirely dotted with craters from bombs and shells. In the air constantly hung the stench of bursting shells, mines, bombs, fires. The wounded, as a rule, got to the nearest medical stations by themselves, which is 1.5 or 2 kilometers away, whereby crawling, whereby hitching a ride. The orderlies were busy only with the heavy wounded, those who could not crawl on their own. I remember a boy junior lieutenant, just like me, who with his chest shot through, clasping the wound with his hand, was half unconscious and wandering to the infirmary. I could not help him. I had urgent combat work, which is discussed below. The dead, and there were many of them, were buried here. However, buried is too loud a word. At best, they covered several men with a cloak tent and buried them in a trench or a large funnel, where there was often water at the bottom. Often they were buried without any cloak tent, face down. It was not uncommon for the dead to lie unburied for several days. I remember in one place there was a spring, 300 to 400 meters from the front line. The trees there were almost all broken by shells and bombs. It was in winter. Soldiers from the nearest units would sneak there to get a pot of water. An enemy sniper, hiding somewhere obviously in neutral territory, was doing his black work. When I got there were already 4 or 5 corpses lying near the spring. At first I didn't understand what was the matter, took a little sip and went on. After 20 to 30 paces, I heard the click of a bullet and turned around. The bullet had gotten another victim, who had come to the spring after me. My task during this period was to provide a wire line of telephone communication between the regiment's observation post and the observation posts of the division commanders, which were directly on the front line in the battalions of the first line. The regiment commander's observation post was located on a strong pine tree about 600 to 800 meters from the front line. A makeshift ladder was attached to the pine tree, and a small platform of poles was made between the branches. Several sheets of iron were reinforced there for protection from bullets and splinters. All day long, either the regimental commander or his deputy was there directing the fire of the divisions. There were 4 divisions in the regiment. The NP of each of them had a telephone line that was laid on the ground. There was no time to hang it from trees. Besides, the hanging line was often broken by shrapnel and sometimes by bullets. On the ground, in many places, ran a large number of telephone lines of different units and divisions. All of them had the same cable, and if a shell or a mine tore several lines with shrapnel, it was not easy to distinguish whose line was whose, especially at night. And the commander demanded constant communication. We had to rotate all day and often at night. The platoon was not fully staffed. At each point, instead of 2 or 3 telephonists, was usually one, constantly day and night, for weeks, months, holding a telephone receiver to his ear. The soldiers adapted to this as well. They tied a small loop of twine or a piece of cable to the telephone receiver and put this loop on their heads, so that many even wiped their hair at the place where the rope was. The telephone could not be abandoned for a minute during the day. Commands and orders were transmitted all the time, and at night every 10 to 15 minutes the serviceability of communication was checked. And if the telephonist did not answer the call, a lineman was sent to the line. I remember one night the telephonist of one of the points did not answer. His call sign was Kazan. There was a soldier on duty there, a Tatar by nationality, who spoke with a rather noticeable accent. I called him several times, but there was no answer. All the telephonists were on other lines, so I had to run myself. I took the line in my hands and ran along it in search of a gust. It's night, it's dark, you can hardly see anything. I ran about a kilometre. The line was intact, and it went to a small dugout where the telephonist was sitting. The dugout had a small ceiling of logs. The entrance to it was through a hole in the ceiling. The depth of the dugout was a little more than a metre. Stuck his head in the hole and called out Kazan. I saw my telephonist sleeping, sitting at the phone, leaning his back against the wall of the dugout, where the light of a piece of burning cable flickered. I repeated stronger. Kazan, the telephonist, answered automatically, Kazan Slushayu. But in order to hear the answer on the phone, it is necessary to press the talking valve in the microphone receiver, and since the soldier was asleep, of course he did not do it, although he answered the call in his sleep. Seeing this, I shouted harder. Kazan, the soldier, shuddered, woke up, pressed the valve, and answered. Having scolded him properly, went back. Usually there were 2 or 3 telephone points in the dugout, artillerymen, mortarmen, infantry, and if there was a break in the line, the telephonist left the telephone in the care of a neighbour and ran to the line. Besides, it was necessary to solve their personal needs, so often soldiers helped each other. One of them put 2 handsets on his head, giving the other a chance to go away for 5 to 10 minutes. It was more difficult when the telephonist was alone. For unauthorized, without permission, leaving his place, the reprisal could be the most cruel, up to shooting on the spot. The front is the front. There is no time to understand whether you are right or wrong. The main thing is the combat work, the combat task. In addition to telephone lines and trench telephone exchanges at the front line, the platoon also served the line to the rear, to the regimental headquarters. Its length was about 5 kilometres. Taking into account that our telephones were weak, we had to spend a lot of effort to make sure that the audibility was good and the line was serviceable. And the longer the line, the more these parameters deteriorated. Especially annoying were the gusts, mainly because of shelling. Having consulted with our squad commanders, we decided to relay the telephone line to the headquarters. The old line ran along the road, where in addition to our line was a large number of others. Even in conditions when the line was intact, we were listening by induction to the negotiations of foreign stations. The route of the new line was chosen mainly through swamps, and where it was impossible, we buried it in the ground. Of course, we had to work hard and soak in the swamps. But then, when the snow fell and covered our line, it worked perfectly until the spring. Explosions of shells and mines, even close to the line, did not harm it. A shell or a mine went into the swamp, throwing out a fountain of mud. The main mass of fragments remained in the swamp. In spring, when the fighting intensified, our line acted flawlessly. Often from other units came to us to pass some urgent order to their unit through our line, and through our regimental headquarters. Once, somewhere in February 1943, the regimental commander ordered us to give a communication to a forward observation post. There was a small hut made of thick logs. From the top it had 2 knurls. In addition, outside the walls were reinforced with vertical poles. This protected to some extent from splinters and bullets. However, a direct hit by a shell would hardly withstand it. When the telephone line was extended, I learned that the regimental commander controlled the fire by radio. The Germans detected the radio station and pelted the dugout with shells and mines. All the ground around the dugout was riddled with craters, literally ploughed over. It is amazing how the dugout itself survived in this hell. As soon as they put a telephone and established communication, immediately the regiment commander began to control the fire by telephone. Another enemy artillery attack. The ground next to the dugout is getting puffy from the bursts. Mostly they are torn in the rear of our dugout, 50 to 70 meters behind. Communication, of course, is out of order. The regimental commander demands to quickly restore communication to transmit a command to suppress the enemy battery. How to send a soldier to such a scorcher. And I only have 2 of them. Jumped out one of them, and maneuvering between the ruptures, ran along the line, holding it in his hand. Soon the connection was restored, but literally for a few seconds and then again cut off. I realized that the communicator was killed or badly wounded if he could not restore the line. I'm sending a second. We watched through the doorway with the chief of communications of the regiment for his game with death. Another burst, or rather a series of bursts, and my liaison officer falls to the ground like a hamstring killed. Soon the artillery attack stopped, but I know it won't last long. I jump out of the dugout and run as fast as I can along the line, jumping over the funnels. There is a gust. I quickly clean and connect the ends. Connected the device. The connection to the side of the NP is there, but in the other, no. Running further, another break. And then another fire attack began. I found myself in the center of this roiling volcano. 2 or 3 seconds between bursts, and I rushed forward and fell into the funnel. I found the other end of the line, lying in the mud in the funnel. I tear the braided cable with my teeth and splice the ends. The shells with a wild howl are tearing around, shrapnel whistling and slapping around, clods of mud hitting my back. I bumped my head into the funnel. Of course it is very scary. It is difficult to endure this frenzied dance of death. A small gap, and I throw myself into a fresh funnel, knowing that according to the theory of probability 2 shells do not fall into the same funnel. But this is theory, and it does not always coincide with practice. The fire raid lasted about 10 minutes, but it seemed like an eternity. There's a little lull. I frantically search for the broken ends of the wire, splice them. I see how the chief of communications of the regiment gives me signs with his hands that there is a connection. Sweat pours down my face and back, although it is winter outside. I lay there for a few minutes, catching my breath. I know that soon there will be a new fire raid. The Germans are pedantic people once they have started shelling. They will continue it until it is necessary to transfer the fire to another target. The Germans have a narrow railroad, and apparently they do not feel the lack of shells, and we have a hard limit, often 1 shell per gun per day. Having had a break, I moved back 100 meters, took cover under a dislocated tree, and waited. Soon the fire raid began again, a wild dance of death. The line, of course, was again broken, and again I frantically searched for the ends of the wires. The raid ended suddenly just as it had begun. Between firing raids, the enemy keeps this section under fire all the time, methodically sending shell after shell every 20 to 30 seconds. The whole line is in knots, and hearing is certainly worse. I have with me, in addition to the telephone set, a spool of cable, 500 meters. Realizing that the Germans did not give up this section and will continue to shell it, I, at one of the nodes near the shelling zone, I connect the wire with a spool and lay the line behind the shelling zone. Several times I had to dash into the funnels as a shell flew threateningly toward me. There was water in the funnels. I was soaking wet, but I pulled the line up. The regimental commander banged his pistol on a kind of table made of poles, demanding communication. Another fire raid again broke the line. And then I appear with the last meters of cable on the reel. The chief of communications grabs it, frantically connects the wire to the phone. There is a connection. The regiment commander between commands encourages me with an approving look the connection works steadily. As and communication at the front is the nerve of the army, and in peacetime too. I took off my boots, poured out the water, wrung out my sweatbands, and went back to work, for the time being for the telephonist. The soldier telephonist, called from the central station, has not yet come up. All January and February continued heavy fighting. Thousands of people were killed, but the result was almost nothing. At the beginning of March 1943, I received an order to organize wire communication to a new area. It was necessary to pull a multi-kilometre line, and the longer the line, the less reliability. With 2 telephonists we pulled the line. Each had 5 to 6 reels of cable, each 7 to 8 kilograms, and a telephone set. I was also loaded with the same weight as everyone else. I was wearing a white camouflage coat. The front line was nearby. All day long we were pulling the line. Tired beyond belief. I barely made it to the intermediate station there. The telephonist built a hut out of spruce and pine branches. A small fire was burning in the hut. I sat down next to the fire and did not notice how I fell asleep. I woke up when my camouflage coat caught fire and burned my face. I had to fall into the snow to put out the smouldering camouflage coat. In March 1943, the offensive of the Northwestern Front began, including the 1st Shock Army, commanded by General Kuznetsov. Early in the morning, all those who acted in the first echelon of the offensive were given epaulettes. I remember how before the attack the soldiers took off their overcoats, remaining only in cotton coats, so that it was easier to attack. On the first day we managed to break through the enemy's defence. The 1st Shock Army operated to the south of the Demyansk cauldron, striking near the villages of Zaloki, Godilovo, Matasovo, at the very base of the neck of the encircled group. The enemy stubbornly resisted. For many months of defence he shot every bush, and now was fierce targeted fire from all types of weapons. In the sky, too, there was a fierce air battle. From there, shrapnel from airplanes was falling to the ground, and sometimes airplanes fell to the ground. The offensive was going hard. Heavy losses were incurred by our troops, but persistently chewed through the enemy defence. The villages of Zaloki, Godilovo, Matasovo were taken. This is already a success. The enemy, feeling that a new boiler was brewing, began to gradually withdraw, levelling the front. Soon the Demyansk cauldron ceased to exist, but it was not possible to encircle the enemy troops. Parts of the 1st Shock Army came to the boundary of the Redia River, and here went on the defence. Combat orders of our 37th Guards Artillery Regiment were located near the village of Podogi. The regiment was supported by the 14th Guards Rifle Corps, which was part of the 1st Shock Army. Spring had fully entered its rights. Everything around was covered with melt water. The roads became impassable. The supply of food stopped. Sometimes U2 dropped a few sacks of breadcrumbs, which turned into crumbs, and only those who managed to find them got them. And since it happened in the dark time, sometimes the sacks fell to the enemy. Besides, the pilot always chose a clearing in the forest and dropped his cargo on it. But in this swampy area the clearing was always a swamp, and often a deep swamp, with mire, and more than one soldier went into this mire in an attempt to get the desired sack. There was no food at all, and hunger was thoroughly agonizing. Sometimes we managed to get cranberries in the swamp, and gnawed birch bark. Once the squad commander, Sergeant Tikachuk, shot some bird, either a magpie or a crow. We boiled soup and ate it in no time. It was considered good luck to find a dead horse. It was immediately cut down to the tail. Everything was used for food. It was boiled for 3 or 4 hours. During this time a lot of foam came out of it. Often horse meat was already years old and of course tough. But hunger did its work. Often in spring a carcass, killed in the fall, appeared from under the snow. It was also used, although as a rule it had a stench. In general, food, especially at the front line, was meagre and irregular. We had to starve often. For the battles in January-March I was awarded the Order of the Red Star. The order was signed by the commander of the 14th Guards Rifle Corps. However, I have not seen the award list and do not know what was written there. Of course, I was proud of this award. I was only 19 years old. I will describe this episode of front life of those years in more detail. The spring of 1943 on the northwestern front came unexpectedly early. Already in March the bright sun melted the snow. The melted water flooded everything around for dozens, maybe hundreds of kilometers. Forests, fields, numerous marshes, everything was flooded with water. Only small hillocks rose above it. Roads were scattered, trenches and dugouts were flooded with water. A sea of water, as far as visibility goes. The guns of our battery were placed on rafts of thick logs. Good thing there was a forest around. I, with a couple of scouts and telephonists, was constantly on the PPP in the battalion, which was attached to our battery. We were lucky our dugout was dug on a small hillside and the water did not reach here. Active fighting stopped. There was no ammunition supply. You can't fight in such a situation. Only occasionally then in one side or the other, separate shots are heard, whether someone has disturbed the guard or some animal or bird has got on the fly. The soldiers, like hares at Grandpa's eyes, settle down somewhere on a fallen tree. The good thing is the coniferous forest, drying in the sun-soaked overcoats, raincoats, tents, scolding unkindly at the vagaries of the weather. All conversations revolve around one topic: will they bring lunch today or not? For many days now we have been on starvation rations. It is good if they give us one dry bread and a mug of boiling water for the whole day. And for us, artillerymen, it is even more difficult. Our division kitchen is somewhere 5 kilometers behind us, in the rear. Try to get there on solid water. Besides, there is only boiling water in the cauldrons. We take dry rations for a few days and then cook in cauldrons ourselves. But for 2 weeks they have not given us almost anything, except some soaked breadcrumbs. All thoughts are reduced to one: what to eat. Sometimes we found cranberries in the bogs. We often picked them waist deep in water, or even fell almost headfirst into the icy bog font. They boiled something like sour cream, adding aspen bark to the berries. The food came out sour, bitter, but still hot, and somehow managed to deceive the stomach, which constantly demanded food. But for more than a week the hikes for cranberries had been fruitless. Everything around was picked. I had a riding horse, which stood here, near the dugout, in a specially dug-in the hillside corral. Poor animal, it met me every time with a longing, hungry look. If we sometimes got some breadcrumbs, there was nothing for the horse. The only fodder was birch and aspen branches, sometimes a scrap of dried, last year's grass. We took care of our horse like the apple of our eye. My soldiers, exhausted from constant malnutrition, were no longer able to make voyages to our kitchen, 5 kilometers there, and as much back, although all of them were not a dozen. The horse helped us out. On it my soldiers took turns every 3 days to go to the battery foreman for provisions. One morning the telephonist on duty reported that I was called to the regimental headquarters. I wondered why I, a platoon commander, would be summoned to the regimental headquarters, where I had never been. I asked the telephonist on the soldiers' telegraph to find out what was going on. Soon he reported that I was called to receive an award, the Order of the Red Star, which I was awarded at the end of last year, 1942. An order is an order, and although not awarded every day and the occasion of course pleasant, but 10 kilometers to the headquarters, and as much back on the solid water, the pleasure is not pleasant. I decided to ride my horse. I went to report to the battalion commander about the received order. He informed me that he was also called, and for the same reason. We congratulated each other. Combat offered to ride together. Our headquarters were located not far from each other. Not far from our pup was a graded road. A smooth arrow cut through the forest in one direction, the district centre Podary Novgorod region. There the enemy, in the other direction, in our rear. We drive on the roadside. On the right side there is a deep ditch, filled to the top with melted water. Many parts of the road are also flooded with water. In front rides the commander, behind him his horse driver, behind me on my horse. Silence, the bright sun is warming up. Nature is timidly coming to life, green grass is peeking out somewhere. We ride by step, our horses are hardly able to trot. And we should look carefully under our feet, because we are near the front line. And minefields are not rare here, especially on the road. The road is deserted, there is no movement. We are riding, as they say, hoof to hoof. Sometimes we exchange words. We have passed about 3 kilometers. Suddenly there was a fountain of water, mud and smoke ahead. I did not have time to realize what happened, but I found myself in a deep ditch with my head in icy water. My horse was struggling next to me, trying to get back on its feet. It was good that I still had time to pull my foot out of the stirrup, or I would have swallowed water while I got out from under the horse. The icy water got under my clothes and into my boots. Ahead in the ditch, the commander's orderly is trying to get out from under the horse. I helped him to get to his feet. There, where the commander was riding, there was a terrible picture. His horse was torn to pieces, beating in convulsions, and here in the ditch, quickly filling with dirty melt water, the torn body of the commander. The lower part of his body, turned by the explosion, mixed with bloody pieces of horse. A terrible, heavy picture. Baked lips barely whispered the last words, ... Ivan. Shoot. Shoot him, my throat tightened with a lump. The horse driver is crying next to me. He doesn't know what to do. I suggest him to wrap the mutilated remains of the combat's body in a cloak tent, take it to the regimental headquarters, and report that the combat has arrived for an award. Silently we ride along the road. Now I am in front. Behind me the horse of the horse driver, which he leads in a lead, on it in 2 cloak tents the remains of the commander. A sad procession. Soon our roads diverge. The highway was left aside. I'm riding through a low-growing spruce forest, an old clearing. On a small hill my horse stops and lies down on its side. I barely managed to jump out of the saddle. I was exhausted. It's still 2 kilometers to the regiment headquarters. My horse looks at me with sad, guilty eyes. I try to pet her and calm her down. She still shudders from the experience. What to do? I can't abandon the horse, but I can't lift it up. The poor animal is completely exhausted. I looked around. There was not a soul around. I took off the saddle, tied the bridle to the nearest tree, put the saddle on my shoulders and walked towards the headquarters. Let the horse rest while I walked. With difficulty I reached the headquarters. It was located in one of the houses of a small village. At the house there was a fire pump, and soldiers almost every hour pumped water from under the house. The floods raised the floor. In the headquarters I was awarded my first Order of the Red Star for past battles, congratulated, poured half a mug of vodka, half a pot of real pea soup, gave a piece of real bread. I had never eaten such a tasty soup before, or after that, or maybe it seemed so to me with hunger. After resting for an hour, I went back to my horse. In my overcoat pocket I had 2 briquettes of pea soup, 2 briquettes of millet porridge, and a few full-sized breadcrumbs. On the side of my belt a flask of vodka was gurgling a fortune. Soon I came to the place where I had left my horse, running from bush to bush, but it was nowhere to be seen. I couldn't be mistaken. Finally I saw an empty bridle tied to a tree, and nearby the tail all that was left of my horse. In the distance, 1.5 kilometers away, the guns of our regiment's batteries were visible. Having weighed on my shoulders the saddle and bridle, I wandered to my pup. The day was already slipping towards sunset. The crimson circle of the sun touched the upper edge of the distant forest. My soldiers quickly boiled 2 pots of pea soup, poured vodka into mugs, stood and silently remembered the commander, and then I once again had to throw my order into the mug. The front life continued. It was my first order, I was in my 20th year, and all the major battles were still ahead of me. One section of my platoon was stationed with me near the front line. We occupied a good dugout in a young fir tree, on a hill. It was said to be a former partisan camp. Here I had an unpleasant experience. During the night one of my soldiers disappeared. He was guarding our and the neighbouring dugout. In the morning appeared workers of counterintelligence SMERSH. They interrogated me and my soldiers, finding out what the missing soldier was. They examined the area around and came to the conclusion that the soldier was taken at night by an enemy reconnaissance group. German boot prints were visible on the ground. Good thing they didn't throw grenades at our dugout. In general, the lesson was serious. We had to strengthen the guards, especially at night. Soon our regiment was withdrawn to the nearest rear, not far from the village of Moltovica, where the regiment was replenished and reformed, was equipped with new equipment. Not far away was the front edge of the former German defences, and we sometimes went there, took down their telephone cable and other property. Often someone was blown up by enemy mines. We were surprised at the German thoroughness with which they had arranged their defences. The dugouts were padded inside with planks. There were boarded 2-storied bunks. Even the toilet was equipped according to all rules. The trenches on the high ground were full height, and the walls were also reinforced with poles or planks. 1.5 kilometres from the front edge was the most real rest house for soldiers, and everywhere there were mountains of bottles. Sometimes there were dugouts, one of the walls of which was made of empty bottles. On the approaches to the German defence in the grass often met the corpses of our soldiers who died in the battles. Nobody buried them. Working as a commander of the communications platoon, I kept asking for an artillery position. Soon my request was granted. In the spring of 1943, I was appointed commander of the 2nd Firing Platoon of the battery. The battery was armed with 76 mm guns of the 1939 model. We held classes on fire training and tactics. We were preparing for new battles. Soon the regiment switched to new staffs. A number of officers, including myself, went out of the staff. We were seconded to the front reserve. The chief of staff of the regiment, signing the assignment order, saw my last name, called, and asked why I did not tell him that I was out of the staff. He said that I had shown myself well in the battles and I should have been left in the regiment, but the order had already been signed. Together with other officers we went to Jedrovo, where the 69th Reserve Artillery Regiment was still located. That's how I got here for the second time. The Reserve Officers' Division was stationed in the forest familiar to me in large dugouts. They were a large square pit on the right and left were earthen bunks covered with spruce lapnik, soldiers' mattresses and pillows stuffed with straw. The roof was double-pitched, with a thick log in the middle, on which lay poles covered with spruce lapnik and covered with earth. That was all the comfort, everything else was in the neighbouring bushes. We washed at the nearest bog, where a hole was dug, and there was always water. We were fed from the usual camp kitchen. The food was the most unpretentious soup and porridge for the second meal and tea. Of course there was no canteen. Primitive tables and seats were built under the trees from poles. Besides the usual food, officers were given once a month an additional ration, a can of canned food, a pack of cookies, a piece of butter or lard, 300 to 400 grams. Everyone was given tobacco. I remember they gave out flavoured tobacco usually. I did not smoke it and gave it to others. This tobacco played a cruel joke. The packets of tobacco looked like packets of tea. The cook asked someone for 1 or 2 packs of tea and put them in the dugout on the shelf where the tea was kept. Early in the morning one day, while making tea, he threw a packet of tobacco into the cauldron instead of tea. We drank the tea in silence. Then someone said that the tea was bitter. Everyone made a noise and gathered around the cauldron. The cook, sensing something wrong, picked up the brew from the bottom with a long ladle. It steamed up and looked like a pile of grass. It became clear that it was tobacco. Having argued and laughed, we parted. By evening we learned that the cook had been arrested by the military counterintelligence SMERSH. They attributed it to an attempt to poison the officers. A ridiculous case, but the fate of this innocent man was decided. In our dugout, as well as in others, there was an untold number of rats. We put the rations on the central beam under the ceiling. The rats quickly killed everything they could get their hands on. We'd come in from lunch, take a nap. As soon as everyone was asleep, the rats in a line one after another crawled on the beam, and the work began. And then, at a barely perceptible wave of the hand, several shots from pistols and nagans were fired at once. The glass jars shatter, the rats tumble to the floor and scatter. But in a few minutes the regimental duty officer comes to find out what the shooting was about. But we are already pretending to be sound asleep. Doppheit got both from the rats and from our shooting, but the rats, in my opinion, did not cause serious damage. In the reserve regiment I met with my former co-workers from the 69th ZAP. They were almost all in their places. It's not a front line here after all. I stayed in the reserve division for a month and was assigned to the 1st Guards Airborne Division. The division was on the northwestern front in the area of Staraya Russa. This town in the Novgorod region was hard hit. It was stormed by our troops for a long time, It was in the range of not only mortar and artillery, but also machine gun fire. Around Stara Russa, there were almost continuous swamps and forests. By the time I arrived at the division, the forest around the town was practically destroyed by artillery and mortar fire. I arrived in the 4th Guards Airborne Regiment in the middle of August 1943. Another attack on Stara Russa began on August 10th. This time several airborne divisions were thrown here, including our division. The fighting was fierce. The paratroopers managed to break through the enemy's defence, to overcome several defence lines, where everything was shot by crossfire, and the area was densely mined. The approaches to Stara Russa were fortified more strongly than it was possible to assume. Many tens of thousands of our soldiers and officers, including paratroopers, were killed here. Before describing my arrival in the regiment, I will briefly talk about the history of the division, where I was to serve and fight. At that time, airborne units operated as ordinary rifle divisions. Airborne troops originated from the pre-war maneuvers of the Kiev military district in 1939. At that time, small paratroopers were thrown out from airplanes. Foreign military attaches were present at the maneuvers, and for them, as well as for many of our commanders, it was a complete surprise. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, our army had already formed several airborne corps, each of which consisted of parachute and airborne brigades, and those in turn from battalions. The predecessor of the 1st Guards Airborne Division was the 4th Airborne Corps. It was stationed in the Belarusian military district. The corps was commanded by Major General A.F. Levashov. From the beginning of the war, the Corps fought heavy battles with the Nazi invaders as part of the Western Front, which was commanded by General Pavlov, hero of the Soviet Union. He was soon removed from his post and shot for losing control of the front, although he was not at fault. Soon the Corps was withdrawn from the battle, concentrated near the town of Tykovo-Gorky region, where it conducted additional staffing and engaged in combat training. By the fall of 1941, the situation at the fronts was extremely difficult. Hitler's troops blocked Leningrad, encircling it from all sides. Only through the Ladoga Lake the connection of the city with the country was maintained. In winter, the ice road was called the Road of Life. The enemy came close to the capital of our homeland. In the early days of December 1941 began the offensive near Moscow. It involved several fronts, including the Kalinin and Western fronts. The enemy was dealt a powerful blow, and he began to withdraw from Moscow to the west. To help the Western Front troops in the development of the offensive, it was decided to throw an airborne landing in the rear of the enemy in the area of the city of Vyazma. The airborne troops were dropped in the area between Vyazma and Dorogobuz, Smolensk region. The landing took place in difficult winter conditions on January 27th to 28th, 1942. Airborne troops did not have special military transport aircraft, and the landing was carried out from bombers. The paratroopers were armed only with light small arms. Detachment from the front, difficulties in providing ammunition and food, had a heavy impact on the actions of our units. The 4th Airborne Corps of Major General Levashov, consisting of the 8th, 9th and 214th Airborne Brigades, was also thrown into the area. The landing took place in dramatic fashion. The Corps commander was killed in the airplane before the landing. Colonel A.F. Kazankin, Chief of Staff, took command of the Corps. Subsequently, paratroopers told about those extremely difficult and bloody battles behind enemy lines. Nevertheless, the paratroopers fulfilled their task. During half a year, until July 1942, it restrained a large grouping of enemy troops in the area. In June-July, on the order of the front, the remnants of the Corps in small groups left the encirclement near the town of Kirov, Kaluga region. The corps that came out of the battle was reorganized into the 1st Guards Airborne Division. After reorganization, the division was sent to the Northwestern Front in 1943. In July-August 1943, the division took part in the battles near Stara Russa, Novgorod region. Here the next offensive began. Here I was assigned to the post of the commander of the control platoon of the 4th Battery of the 2nd Division of the 4th Guards Airborne Artillery Regiment. Several of us were assigned to the division, including Lieutenant Kulakov Ivan Yakovlevich, now a retired colonel. We became friends then, and have maintained our friendship until now. Except for me, all the others, as they say, did not smell gunpowder, for the first time got to the front, and I, as I could, explained to them what and how it happens in the war. By evening we reached the area where the division was located. It was difficult to look for our regiment in the forest in the evening, so I suggested to spend the night and in the morning to look for the regiment. We found an empty dugout at the edge of the forest. Its floor was covered with grass. The dugout was low, you could stand only on your knees. The front lived its own life. Somewhere in the distance was heard artillery cannonade. On the roads went cars loaded with ammunition and food. All these front signs were well known to me, so I laid down on the grass, covered myself with the hollow of my overcoat, and quickly fell asleep. In the morning we found the headquarters of our regiment quite quickly. We formalized the documents, and I left to look for my 4th battery. It was in the middle of August, 1943. By this time the offensive on Staraya Russa was already exhausted. Having broken through the deeply echeloned enemy defence, the regiments of the division advanced 8 to 10 kilometres and came close to the city, but they could not seize it. Losses on our side were very large. There were swamps all around, the forest was destroyed by shells and mines, everywhere there was rubble from fallen wood. It was impossible to use equipment, including tanks here. This was one of the reasons for the failure of the next offensive. But the breakthrough of the enemy defence and advance for several kilometres for the northwestern front was a significant event. The commander of the 4th Battery was at his NP, which was located near a large fallen tree. Here was also the battalion commander of one of the regiments, which supported our division. Appearing at the NP, I stopped near the battery commander and began to report my arrival at the post. But he immediately, pulling me by the half of my overcoat, shouted that I should lie down, because somewhere not far away sits an enemy sniper and can easily kill. I knelt down and reported. I felt some elasticity under my knee. I picked with my boot, and it turned out that the killed man was covered with a thin layer of earth under me. Combat said that here the whole area is strewn with corpses, both our and German. There was no time to bury them and nowhere to bury them. There were swamps all around. Therefore, if possible, we buried them with earth, covered them with spruce or pine lapnik. That's all the honours. In general, human life was often devalued at the front. It was important to fulfil the task, and at what price it was obtained, few people seriously bothered. And if they did, it was only in the sense that the replenishment would not be soon, and the tasks must be solved now. I quickly got acquainted with the platoon, or rather, with those who were at the NP. The battery-controlled platoon, which I was to command, consisted of reconnaissance, telephone, radio and calculator departments. The main task of the platoon reconnaissance of the enemy, detection of his firepower and determination of the coordinates of targets, as well as providing communication between the battery observation post with the firing position of the battery, which was located from the NP usually 2 to 3 kilometres in the rear. In addition, when the battery was firing, it was necessary to monitor the bursting of shells and coordinate the battery's fire. Many who are unfamiliar with military affairs for some reason believe that the main thing in reconnaissance to get language, that is, to take a prisoner. In reality, this is far from true. Taking a tongue, although to a certain extent romantic, but far from the main thing in intelligence. Language, even the most talkative, could tell how many in the platoon or company machine guns and other combat equipment. But knowing the organization of the German army, it was not difficult to determine this themselves. But where at the moment are on the ground these firepower, this is already a task of intelligence. Here we needed the coordinates of the target. This is it, that is, detecting targets, putting them on a map or tablet, determining the coordinates of the targets and preparing the initial data for firing, and were engaged in reconnaissance departments and calculator under the guidance of the platoon commander of the control platoon. The 4th Battery, to which I was assigned, consisted of my control platoon and 2 firing platoons, each of which had 2 76 mm's 3 division guns on horse-drawn traction. Each gun was carried by 6 horses. The battery stood on closed positions, remote from the front line for 3 or 4 kilometres. The enemy was seen only by the battery commander, KVU, and his scouts. They corrected, or rather controlled the battery's fire when firing at targets. The terrain around was swampy, overgrown with bushes, and if there was a drier place there were trees, which were mostly broken by shells and mines. Since a week there were local battles, the enemy was stubbornly defending, his swamps for defence were more advantageous. We could not use tanks, the main striking force in breaking through the enemy's defences. The troops of the front, including our division, could not conduct an offensive, heavy losses of personnel and an acute shortage of ammunition, especially shells.